Welcome to today's episode of Just Call Dad. I am extremely excited to sit down with Jeff Barry, author, educator, business owner, and most importantly, dad, on today's episode to talk about all of those things and more as we delve into the world of being a dad who can be just a call away on good days, bad days, and all of those in between days. Jeff, how are you today?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well too. We were just chatting before we got on this live recording about how I haven't slept really all night and how you're giving me some hope because you have kids that are older than mine and someday these days will shift and change. So I appreciate your wisdom so far.
Well, it sounds like though you might be a little bit better of a dad than I am because my wife will tell you I wasn't quite as good of an all-night dad as probably you are. So you know, I got up some, but I wasn't the best get up in the middle of the night dad and do the bottle as probably you more modern day dads are. So that's some good progression in our culture, I guess.
My
It
dad's
wasn't
always talked
never,
about
but it
that.
wasn't all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
My dad and I had that conversation. It was kind of cool, actually, just to
yeah.
start with this because we talked about that too. Because his dad never did that kind of stuff, and he never really knew how to show emotion. Actually, one of the big reasons
Mm,
behind this podcast was
yep.
talking about our emotions. And my dad actually and I have had a conversation over and over the last probably 5, 10 years of me becoming a dad that we never used to have, and that's about how we
Mm,
feel. We never
mm,
did. We never talked about
yep.
that. He didn't really know how to. He had the feelings, he just didn't know how to communicate them, and I was able to communicate them, but didn't understand them. So it's kind of cool
Yep.
because it was able to really bridge a gap between us, and it's cool to watch him be a grandpa to my
Mm,
girls. He raised one son and was my coach, and in a good and bad way placed pressure on me to be successful because he wanted me to
mm,
be. And
yep.
it's so fun to watch his soft side as he probably does even more with them, in terms of all that. Great dad, love to
Yep.
play with me.
Right.
I got a great mom too. But yeah, to your point, I think that's a great start to our podcast is when we're talking about dads, like there's so many different generational expectations for dads. And I think specifically for people like yourself, you're balancing a lot and have throughout your whole life, right? You're kind of you like to be busy and not in a bad way, but you like to get things done. And so tell us a little bit, Jeff, about your life, about what you do, what you have done, or what you are currently doing.
Yeah. So I'm from Memphis and spent most of my time there, except for 5 years. I guess I was in college and grad school at Vanderbilt, and then we spent a little time in Peru on a teaching stint. I was teaching English, really ESL. So we picked up the whole family and headed over there. Our kids were about 10 to 5, ages three, have three children. They're now between 21 and 25. I have two daughters and one son. Now they are, then they were between about 10 and 5. So you young dads, it's always hard, but we just picked everybody up and everybody was on board. My wife was on board. We moved to Peru for a season and taught English, and it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. It was, it's always hard. It's always a hassle organizing and picking up and leaving your life here because you got to kind of start a whole new one over there. But it's one of our best memories and one of the best memories of my kids too. So anyway, that's that's a little of I guess the parenting, a little background. My dad, speaking of dads, he had me very late in life, and he was born in 1920, and so he was in the. As a matter of fact, his granddads both fought in the Civil War. So I would say I'm one of the youngest people to have two great granddads that fought in the Civil War. My dad was a B-24 pilot in World War II. He grew up in the Great Depression, poor, didn't go to college. He was shot down over Germany and was a POW in Germany for 13 months. And so that had obviously a huge impact on his life. And I grew up listening since I was the youngest, all the others, I had four other siblings. They were all way older than me. They were typical baby boomer generations. And so they were having kids that were my nephews who were like my little brothers growing up. So I had about literally nine little brothers growing up around the corner. And that was really cool. But anyway, my dad, my book is the main character. A lot of his war history I've put into it, which we might get into it in a minute. But he was also very like that generation. Talking about stoic. I guess my generation's kind of an in between, maybe between his and yours, or mine's probably a little closer to your end in age. But like feelings, I never heard one expression of feeling. He could write it in his later years and say he loved you. I love you, but I don't remember him saying it. I know he did. He kind of showed his love by time. We spent tons of time one on. I got to spend tons of time one on one with him because I was basically the only kid at the time. The others were all gone, and so, I knew he loved me, but he just, and I could tell. I kind of feel he wanted to say it, especially in his later years and all of that, but he had trouble. And I really wish now, as I've been a dad longer, I could go back and maybe have some of those conversations maybe you had with your dad. And I just don't know, man. I don't know if it would have gone anywhere or not. I did kind of try to breach the subject a little bit, but it didn't really go anywhere. But anyway, you asked about what I've done. I was been in the land business about 15 years. 25 years. Dealing with primarily a lot of farmland, some development land, farmland, and conservation land, and that would be from a little brokering, but more buying with partners and improving the land, and then selling it. My favorite was the conservation land side of it, and then recently, the last year, been actively mainly promoting the book, and I was teaching at University of Tennessee, Chattanooga.
I could listen to you talk all day, Jeff. I got to be honest with you. Ever since you and I have connected,
Be careful.
there's so many things about you that just make me happy. And one of the things that I love is your authenticity and just your openness to share about who you are and the experiences that you've been through. I am so just into this concept of how you wrote your book, but then I think about all the connections that the reason I love what you're doing is because I feel it. Even though my dad was not one of those pilots, my dad was not one of those people. We all have a dad experience, and Just Call Dad is all about that. It's all about navigating your dad experience, both the one you have currently as a dad, but also that experience leading up to being a dad. I always talk about all the time. I never had a crash course on how to be a girl dad. I never had a crash course on that. There's a million books on it, but all those books are not directly associated with the kids that you're going to have. I also never had the opportunity to practice to be a NICU dad, or what that would be for my family, or the pressure that would be, or the worries that would create internally for me for periods of time because of that experience. And I oftentimes think about parents of kids with special needs, which is a passion of mine as well. They don't necessarily get a chance to prepare. You're learning as you go. And I think as dads, no matter how your kid, what they have in their life as a roadblock or obstacle, I think about my own dad looking at me from that perspective and maybe not being able to communicate that, but feeling the same way that I'm feeling. How can I help my son? How can I help him? As a kid, I had emotional issues. I would get frustrated easily. I would be a perfectionist. I would get angry. And I often wonder if he was covertly, without meaning to, trying to help that with different things that he would do. I spent one-on-one time with my dad, and I still do, as an electrician. He has his own business, and so I would work in the summers with him. I recently lost my grandpa, who was also in the military, and he had a plumbing business, and I would spend one-on-one time with him. And it was so interesting that as you share all of these stories, I think everybody has a story to write about their dad. And I know that your story about your dad is very powerful, and not only powerful, but it resonated with a lot of people. From what I've read and researched, your book was on the New York Times best-selling list. And as a person, I'm trying to be an author, right? I'm trying to figure out how to write books that resonate with people. And that's why I'm just like, okay, Jeff, tell us about this book. Tell us about why it resonates with so many people, because I feel it and I know I hear it in your voice. But I think part of it for me is because we all have a dad story to tell. And the fact that you told it in the way that you did is special. So tell us about the book. Tell us
Yeah,
about just whatever you want to say about it, because I just want to learn from you.
yeah. Well, thanks. I would say, let me do a little plug here. I was thinking earlier this morning, like if you asked me something about fatherhood or parenthood, and that is what my book really is about. It's about a father and his daughter, and being a father to two daughters. That's really where the whole storyline of the book came from. But back to what I was saying, if I had, I was thinking like, what would I say is one, you know, quote bit of advice or whatever you call it that I think is most effective or important in
Hmm.
my journey as a father, and that has been one-on-one time. And I mean, I know a lot of. I mean, I literally had dates with my daughters. Well, I was better with the oldest one because we didn't have as much going on. But we had a date every week. We would did every birthday. We'd go on a weekend. And with my son, it was an easier outlets because he liked, and my oldest daughter did too. They both like to fish and do whatever outside. Camp, I'd take them camping. My youngest, it was more of a challenge because she didn't like really the outdoors, didn't like hunting, didn't like camping. Matter of fact, that was what I used for discipline for her in high school when she got in a little bit in trouble. I'd literally try to think of what are the things I can take away or make her do that she would make her, that she most does not want to do. And it was taking her phone away, and it was making her go camping with me. And then, because she hated it, quote, hated it, we ended up going and she loved it. Build a fire, you sit around, you end up talking, and she forgets that how much she, quote, hates it. Then y'all get in a tent. And so that one on one time, there is a dynamic there I found that is when you're with the whole family, that's great. That's also very important. But there's something else that comes out with that. And I actually got to spend a ton of one-on-one time with my dad, even though he was not a communicator or expressive or could show his feelings. He did with time, and since I was the youngest by far, I got to spend a lot of one-on-one time with him and with his World War II buddies also. So anyway, that would be my one plug. Was the most more you can do that. Weekends, lunch, date, what, and you got to kind of sometimes get creative. With my youngest, I've really had to try to figure out, like, well, what can we do together that she wants to do, and it's basically you try to figure. And she wasn't as athletic. No offense to her, but my first two were very athletic, so we had tons of sports activities. And so anyway, that's kind of the background there. As far as the book, I've always written, and my dad got me going on that too. I got to give a Mexican cowboy named Penguin from the 1980s credit for my writing career. That's a long story, but we were down there on a adventure trip in a jungle, next to a jungle. My dad, and his generation, they weren't exactly helicopter parents, and so there was these Mexican cowboys going out on a wild boar hunt in the jungle the next morning, and I was like, Dad, can I go? And he was like, sure, go ahead. So I just showed up, and after daybreak the next morning, Dad was back at the little bitty ranch house where we were staying with this family. And I spent the whole day in the jungle. It was an adventure. I won't go. It's a crazy adventure of a lifetime. But Penguin was this cowboy who was his buddies had named him because he very much resembled a penguin when you would look at him. And he wore a cowboy hat and boots and smoked all the time. I was like, man, this guy ain't gonna be able to keep up with me. I couldn't keep up with him. But all that to say, my dad said on the way back, he's like, hey, you ought to, I was about 13 or 14 at the time. And he said, you ought to write this story up. And he did express himself through writing, like I said, more than verbally. And so I wrote up a little short story or a little account of it, and he read it. And, then I started kind of writing. And then he would get me to do that on other little outings. And we really, then I started kind of using writing in journals. I wrote in journals, especially when I was, struggling with things. And anyway, then I did that my whole life. Then I started a blog around my 40s when I was about 40, when my dad, my second mom, and my sister all died of different incidents within about a year and a half. And I was really struggling and went through some other stuff too around that time. And I just started blogging, actually dealing with some of this. And I had a blog, put it out there. People said, you ought to start writing a book. You ought to write a book. And so I was like, yeah, maybe. And then I was in Holly Springs, Mississippi, working on a land deal. That's kind of the hill country of Mississippi. It's not the Delta. And so anyway, I was standing at the corner of the town square, and the idea of the book hit me. I was thinking, what would be my worst nightmare as a dad, as a father? And it just kind of hit me like one of my daughters got into a really dangerous, bad, tough situation, and I couldn't help her. A and B, she was kind of in it because of me. I'd kind of helped put her there, and so that's the storyline of my book, and it's very much based on it's kind of a Southern family saga. It's a historical fiction. Like I said, a lot of my dad's war history is in there. He's got some amazing stories. That's where the title actually comes from. Go to Hell, Ole Miss, believe it or not, from his first night in captivity as a POW in Germany, all alone in a German shed. He was alone. He'd had his crew bail out, many miles earlier, and he was trying to get the plane back and wasn't able to, had to bail out last minute. So he was locked in this German shed, and it happened all alone. He was married to my future mom, who was living on the Ole Miss campus, sorority girl at Ole Miss at the time. And so the story around this Go to Hell Ole Miss was actually a very redemptive and hopeful story that helped him get through the war and some of the harder times of being a POW. And so anyway, it's got a lot of historical. There's a lot of other true history in it. So it's basically a family saga, historical fiction, and it's the main plot line is about a father and I think the publisher, the line they put on the back, to what extent will a father go to protect his daughter? And I'd had a little bit longer one, about a father's willingness to do almost anything to protect his daughter from a situation that he kind of helped create. So it's got a lot of that, and it's a redemptive. Goes into some. It's kind of my goal in the book was from the start. I walked in a bookstore and there was, thousands, umpteen. I just learned like Square Books in Oxford, kind of the most iconic Southern bookstore, which I learned last week that we hit on their their bestseller list of last year as well. And I said, well, how many books are in this bookstore? And they said, 35,000 different titles. So I walked into a bookstore that was much bigger. It probably had 100,000. I was like, man, I love books, but I don't just want to write another book. I mean, there's a lot of books out here, and so I wanted a book of substance with characters that become people who make you laugh, cry, and think, and that's been my goal. And a lot of that comes out through that father-daughter relationship, and another. It's kind of like a father-son relationship. The main character, his nephew, is one of the narrators, and he's a young 15-year-old boy. And so their relationship is, it's like a father-son, because his father is, the boy's father is, going through PTSD from, actually, he was a younger brother, kind of like I was to my siblings, but he was a younger brother to the main character, who was a World War II veteran, like my dad. That's where my dad's stuff comes. But he was dealing with a lot of PTSD and drinking, and so the boy spent basically all this time with this uncle, who's the main character. So all of that is very much central to the book.
That's so powerful. I'm sitting here just thinking about 100 things just pinging in my brain about why this book is popular. And I think the main reason that I feel like as a dad of daughters is that concept of what would I do if my daughter was in a situation and I couldn't help her. And I've walked through a season like that recently at 36 where my health has been up and down from stress.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like the most fit guy, or I thought I was one of the fittest guys in the room, and I got hit with some health things and I became one of the weakest in the room. Not necessarily from other people's perspective, but from my own internal viewpoint on myself. And I think a lot of that stemmed from the exact thing you just talked about, is feeling like I couldn't save my daughters even if I tried. But knowing that even if it was the last ounce of my strength, I would give it all for them. And I find that to be so powerful. And I feel like the way you write this book is so clear that you get lost in the narrative in a positive way, so that then people are actually dealing with some of these emotional things that I might be dealing with or other dads might be dealing with without realizing it. It's almost like a mastercraft in that. And I think a lot of times I write books that are mindset-based books, and I write kids' books. And when I write a kid's book, my goal is to do what I just said to you for kids, to hide narratives in there to help them. Because I think a lot of times when we present a mindset book to an adult or a kid, they're dismissive at times of the content unless they want to receive it. But when we present them with a story they can hide themselves and find themselves in the story and allow that vulnerability. So I think that in my viewpoint of how you're describing the story, of how you're describing how you made the story, is really powerful. And I feel like people need more of that. We either have fluff stories that have no meaning, or we have too much mindset based information where they're kind of stuck in the middle. And so I love, not only do I love what you're saying, but I mean, I can't wait for more dads to hear this and maybe to just grab that book and start reading and start just thinking about how that connects to their own story. And I'm also a history guy. I minored in history in college. And so I love the idea of history and how history not only repeats itself, but also can inform us on our current situation, even as dads, too. So I think the next thing I would really like to ask you, I guess, kind of to clarify on that for dads, you gave that piece of advice that one-on-one time. This podcast is really focused on mental health, and it's focused on the idea that like we all need somebody to call. Like we need it. Like Jeff, I need it, you need it. We're not too tough for that. So what would you tell a dad today who is in maybe my shoes, right? I've got 3 young kids. I want to spend one-on-one time. I'm trying to work. I'm trying to make money for my family. I'm trying to be there. I'm trying to do all these things. I want to write a book. I have passions, all of this stuff. It seems like, I don't want to say you figured it out because I know you still have struggles and things you're working through, but what did you do to kind of get yourself, when you said at 40, you reached that kind of stuck point? Because I've been through that right now. How did you get to that next level to where you are today?
Let me ask you, is that background noise? Do you notice that? Is that a
I
problem?
do. It's
Okay, I
fine.
can go
It's
to
no
another
big deal.
room. It's my son's. He's got this plant deal, like they
Oh,
call it
it's
a
all good.
tower, and he's growing fruits and vegetables. So
That's so
you mean
cool.
walk to the other room, or keep
No,
going with it?
it's just called Dad Podcast. Is all about going with whatever life brings at you. So don't even worry about it. It's kind of
Oh, you
nice,
want to
soothing
leave it?
background.
Leave it. Stay
It's
here or
not.
go? Let's
It's
stay
not.
here.
It's not bothering me at all.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
it's kind of a calming background noise. But yeah, what's that
Okay.
advice, Jeff? I mean, right? We're all so stressed all the time. I mean, seriously, like,
Yeah.
and I know you work with students at UT Chattanooga, and like you're gonna run into people who are like they're stressed out, and I feel like how do we get through this, and how do we see the other side of the stress in the positive way?
Yeah, I would say, and I certainly don't have everything figured out. And I've certainly
No, it's
made
okay.
mistakes, and I think everybody's going to, and everybody does. I would say so. Kind of let yourself off the hook a little bit. One thing my dad did that I thought was really interesting, and I've tried to really encourage it. Like is to with my son particularly, but also with my daughters when I would know you know my wife, I would encourage her to kind of lead this charge. But like with my son, for example, I try to get him around as many of my friends that I thought would be, good influences on him as possible. Like, he's texting one about this growing deal that he's got, this tower, and this kind of tower garden, and that's who got him going on this. And my dad did that. He kind of wanted me to spend time with his buddies and kind of get their advice too. And I've seen a lot of dads, and that was whether it was spiritual or about career or sports or whatever. I've seen a lot of dads. I don't know if it's an insecurity or what, but they're like they kind of want to hold all the cards on raising their kids. And I'd say the more you can have your children around teachers, coaches, other mentors, the better, that you trust. And anyway, so that was part of the deal. I would say too, this is known as what the anxious generation now, right? And so I think the cell phone is a huge, the iPhone is a huge part of that. You would know, more, but I mean, there's a book on it. The generation, I mean, the college kids that I just taught, that's kind of the quote classic anxious generation. I don't know how that, if that apply to your age children or not, but and my children have all struggled a lot with that, frankly, with anxiety and dealing with some of this. And I don't really, I would say, as long as, I wish we didn't let them have iPhones real early, but I wish we delayed it even more. Like most of their friends had them before they did. But and with dads on that one-on-one time or family time, man, so easy to always get obsessed and addicted without even realizing it to the iPhone, your phone, and checking emails, text, and whatever. And so, your kids pick up on that. They know, oh, that phone's more important than me. And so I'd say as much as you can, leave that. I won't say this is not a podcast, I don't think, with choice language, but leave that, in the over on the charger as much as you can when you get home, and try to focus that. And in carpool, when I drive carpool, I wouldn't allow them to be on their phones, and I wouldn't be on mine either. And they didn't really love that at first, but they learned to like it. That's how you talk. And so anyway,
I love it.
I don't know, I don't have I hadn't figured out a lot of answers or advice, but those are some of the things that I've found helpful.
Well, you gave a lot of advice actually. So I like the concept of getting your kids around good influences and good influencers, because I think with our generation, you're right. There is going to be a social media component. There is going to be a phone component. But if we can use it better, right? Because I'm utilizing social media more than I ever have to try to promote dad stuff, to try to help, right? And so there are things that help, but I think there's a line and a level of anxiety. And I even feel it as somebody who's doing a podcast, because what if someone doesn't like what you say, or what if someone
Hmm.
doesn't want to hear it? But really, a lot of times for me, I've dealt with that even before social media, as a teacher, as an educator, always trying to be really uplifting and encouraging and positive. And I think sometimes, no matter how positive you try to be, it's people's interpretation of that. So if we can get our kids around people who are going to help them kind of sift through that narrative and be able to hold on to the positivity, I think that's great advice for dads out there. I also wrote down this concept of boundaries. So a lot of times whenever you're sharing, that word keeps popping in my head about boundaries. And I wonder if that's just something that you've developed over time, through failure, through success, through seeing the positives and the negatives and how you've raised your kids and seeing them as adults. And I think that's really cool about this Just Call Dad podcast, because I'm having dads in all walks of their dad journey on this. And I think that's powerful. I love this concept of, you've learned the boundaries. You've learned where your boundaries are as a dad and as a human. And then it's that idea of not getting stuck thinking you have it together. So I can tell by talking to you that you have a lot of knowledge, right? You know how to do a lot of things, but you have been okay to humble yourself enough to say, this is where my boundary is, and here's where someone else can step in. And honestly, that's my whole mission of Just Call Dad, is maybe having a podcast recording where a dad can hopefully have their kid at some day listen to this, and say, hey, son, here, so and so, or hey, daughter, so and so talked on this podcast. Here's something I've been trying to tell you. Because I also know this as an educator, I can say something to a kid that their parents been wanting to tell them forever, or as a coach, and it makes a greater impact on them than if the parent said it. And I'm even noticing that with my own daughters now, because daddy might be able to do that for other people's kids, but sometimes not for his own. So we all have a role to play in that story, and I really love how you're sharing that role, and not only sharing it, but how you're promoting it to this anxious generation. And I really feel like maybe that's my whole mission. Before I started this podcast, I was diagnosed with anxiety, and I didn't know what that meant, and I felt really frustrated, because I was like, I'm not supposed to be anxious, I have faith, I have this, I have all these layers. Like, what do you mean anxious, anxiety? Felt weak, I felt broken. And again, I've said it on a couple other podcasts, but I had a panic attack that led into this concept of Just Call Dad, because I called my dad. He was the first call that I made. And he was able to tell me that he'd had something similar and never talked about it. So I
Mm.
don't know. I think it's just like, I mean, like
Yeah.
I think that's where it's at with it today, Jeff, is this concept of like talking, not over talking, because sometimes I want to just laugh and be silly. Because honestly, I think anxiety comes from that too. Like, we're too serious all the time. At least I know I am. And maybe we just need to have fun, and laugh a little bit, go camping, get outside, appreciate the things that we do wrong when we screw up. And so, yeah, I think that's what I got from your advice here. And so I like to keep these about, 30 minutes or around, just because I want dads and families and people to listen to this that would maybe not necessarily go to church or go to a location where they, go to a class, or because they don't have time, right? Time's a big component of that. But hopefully with our podcast, no matter what walk of faith you have, no matter what walk of life you have, no matter if you've been a good dad, a bad dad, or somewhere in between, you can hop on for 30 minutes and just kind of use this as a workout for your brain and say, hey, I'm doing this, or maybe I want to improve this. So as we end today, is there anything that pops into your mind as a dad that you'd like to share? And also, how can people connect with you? How can they find your book? How can they learn more about Jeff Berry?
Yep. Yeah, so I would say the first thing, real quick, the last thing I'd have on parenting and being a dad is, like my dad's generation, it was more rule based, right? Tradition, rule based. Is we've gotten it's now more relational based, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which has been a good progression. But I realize that kids don't want you to just be their friend, right? And so it's finding that balance between being the father and friend and fun person, like you just said. And it's different for everyone. But at the end of the day, I do believe the relationship comes first, and when you have that is solid as you can have, and that's going to go through ups and downs through our journeys and their journeys, but then you have more of a framework to be able to in that relationship to be able to quote enforce your rules or what have you.
Right.
And
Right.
so in the book, I feel like it is a book about faith, and doubt, hope amidst hardship, and redemption, and a little bit of revenge too. And so, anyway, I think it's a journey. It was a journey for me, and I enjoyed it. And I've struggled a little bit since I finished it because I did, I felt called and inspired to write this book, and I poured a lot of my life into it. And anyway, it's been a little bit of it's been an adjustment, since I finished it. But I hope people will check it out. I think it'll show you through the main character, particularly, and his brother, the ups and downs and of parenting and mistakes, and but then also, it's set in 1970, Mississippi Hill Country, so it's a kind of Southern novel, historical fiction. And if people want to learn more, I guess the best way you could check out my website, Jeff, Jeff dash Berry or hyphen Berry, BARRY.com, Jeff-Berry.com. My social media there, I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook, and love for people to check it out. And you can get it at Barnes and Noble or your local bookstore, or on Amazon, of course. So and you can also see options on the website. If my email's on there as well, if people are interested and want to touch base.
Awesome. And I know I have added you as a follower on Instagram. I clicked on that so I can keep up with what you're doing, and hopefully you can do the same, and we can keep up with each other. And I'll clip this thing up and have a bunch of reels in a really fun way. I've been loving it. I also do trick shots, so I'll get you a trick shot into your video, so we'll have some fun. It's my little plug on how we can clean up more fun with our kids. So have a little fun thing with that. And then, the biggest thing I would say, Jeff, is I know this time that I've shared with you and the couple conversations that I have had with you prior have been life-changing for me as a dad. So I appreciate it. I want to say thank you. And I can't wait to continue to develop a relationship and a friendship as I learn from amazing people like yourself. And so if you're listening to this podcast, if you're going through something, if you're walking through whatever it is, good, bad, somewhere in between, just remember, all you have to do is stop and pause. Praise the things that you know are going well, and just say this: today, I'm going to make it the best version of that day. All right, one day at a time. Let's make today the best version. All right, Jeff, you got this thing. All right, audience, thank you for tuning in, and we'll chat soon.